A term that is used to describe this new ideology of Germany and Italy and Japan is fascism. And fascism can be described as extremely nationalistic, with the goal being to unify all people in a nation towards some sort of common goal. Fascism is militaristic. It's okay to use military force to put down your enemies. And fascism is anti-democracy, anti-feminism, and anti-communism. Fascists thought that liberal democracy, which promoted individualism, divided people in a nation. They thought that communism, which focused on class struggle, divided the nation. Fascists thought that feminism divided the nation along gender lines. The only thing that mattered was the nation. And this ideology, it was revolutionary in the sense that fascists wanted to get rid of governments that existed in Europe, so they wanted to overthrow governments. So they were revolutionary in that sense, but it was conservative in the sense that they celebrated traditional values as opposed to individualism and materialism of modern life. So some of the principles of fascism were appealing in Europe and Japan following World War I. Especially in Europe, people were disillusioned. For middle and upper class people, more well-to-do people, they were scared that communism would take what they have. And this wasn't just the super rich, so small-scale merchants and craftspeople, farmers. They were scared that they were going to lose their business or their farms to the state. Fascism was appealing to soldiers. Fascism was appealing to some intellectuals even who were upset over the materialism of modern life. So, we were saying before, a lot of people lost faith in the power of democracy and capitalism to create a better life. And these people in general proved fairly receptive to the message of fascism. What's generally not well known is that fascist movements actually appeared in a lot of Western European countries, France, Great Britain, the Netherlands, but these movements didn't have a big impact. There were more significant fascist movements in Austria and Romania, and you get to some bigger fascist movements in Spain. The rise of fascism led to Spanish Civil War between 1936 and 1939, which pitted fascists against communists within Spain, with the fascists winning out, and the fascist regime in Spain would stay in power until the 1970s. The first fascist movement emerged in Italy under the leadership of Benito Mussolini, and Italy did not become a unified country until 1870, and when Mussolini came on the scene, Italy was a democracy, but it didn't have a long tradition of democracy like Britain or France or the United States. So, like I was saying, after World War I, there were a lot of soldiers who were upset with the outcome. Mussolini appealed to this resentment and formed his own private army of unemployed soldiers called the Black Shirts. So he made his private army, and with his private army, Mussolini promised that he would provide an alternative to both democracy and to communism. Mussolini was a very charismatic speaker and became a popular voice in Italy, and eventually he was elected to power. But once he was elected to power, his private army attacked all of his opponents. So they murdered socialists, they outlawed unions, they eliminated political parties and democratic elections. What Mussolini did represent was order, and in the context of post-World War I Italy, a lot of people seemed willing to give these things up to have more order. Culturally, Italian fascism focused on embracing traditional Italian values. Mussolini himself was an atheist, but he supported the Catholic Church, and he supported the creation of the Vatican as its own state within Italy. He made Catholicism Italy's national religion. Militarily, after getting rid of his enemies within Italy, one of Mussolini's first actions was to conquer Ethiopia. Italy invaded and conquered Ethiopia in 1935. In 1896, Italy had been humiliated by Ethiopia. Italy had tried to make Ethiopia a colony, but they were defeated, and this was seen as an act of redemption for Italy. Mussolini's ultimate ambition was to create a new Roman Empire, and the conquest of an African colony was seen as his first step. The German version of fascism ended up being much more important to world history. The German version of fascism came in the form of Adolf Hitler and Nazism. Hitler and Mussolini had a lot in common. Both were extremely nationalistic, both led one-party dictatorships, both were good public speakers, both were anti-communist, anti-feminist, and anti-democracy, and both were pro-war. Hitler's rise in Germany was also similar to Mussolini's rise in Italy. Germany was pretty much destroyed by World War I. Hundreds of thousands of Germans lost their lives fighting for Germany, and now Germany was being told by the world that the war was all their fault, that they had to pay for the war, that they weren't allowed to have an army anymore, that essentially they were never going to be a world power. When Germany lost the war, the politicians that led Germany to war all sort of disappeared from the scene, and a new German government emerged. This new state was supported by the victors of World War I, and it did what it could to cooperate with the victors. This was called the Weimar Republic. The leaders who led the Germans to defeat never actually took responsibility for defeat. Instead, they criticized the German politicians who had the really terrible job of trying to enforce the Treaty of Versailles. And then there was a myth that spread around Germany that Germany had never actually lost the war, but that these politicians, this Weimar Republic, had betrayed Germany and sued for peace. And these people were all communists and Jews that had betrayed the German nation. So just like in Italy after the war, the politicians who took over Germany after World War I had a really tough job. In Germany, a group of disgruntled veterans calling themselves the Free Corps murdered hundreds of these new German politicians, as well as journalists, who were trying to cooperate with the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. And these soldiers, the Free Corps, the ones that assassinated the German politicians, were never really punished by the courts for doing this. So, things were terrible in Germany after the war. And that was before the Great Depression hit. And then the Great Depression hit. And the German economy all but stopped. There was so much inflation that there's stories that you would need a wheelbarrow of paper money to buy a single loaf of bread. And much of the working class first turned to socialism and communism for answers, and others looked to fascist movements. And this was the historical context in which Hitler's National Socialist or Nazi Party was able to gain the support of the public. The Nazi Party formed soon after World War I and quickly came under the leadership of the disillusioned World War I veteran Adolf Hitler. And Hitler's message was one of intense German nationalism, but he cast his nationalism in terms of racial superiority of the Germans, and had a bitter hatred towards Jews and any foreigners or non-German people in Germany, and he had an equally passionate hatred for communism and a determination to rescue Germany from the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. At first, the Nazis weren't really taken too seriously. They were there in the 1920s, but most people didn't take notice. So, for example, in 1928, the Nazi Party got less than 3% of the national vote. But 4 years later, after the Great Depression had hit and the Weimar Republic had failed to effectively deal with the Depression, the Nazis got 37% of the vote, more than any other party, and Hitler became the chancellor of the German government. When Hitler came to power, he immediately called an end to the Weimar Republic, which was established after World War I, and established what he called the Third Reich. And when Hitler came to power in Germany, he did a lot of the same things that Mussolini did in Italy. He outlawed all political parties, he outlawed unions, he arrested his political opponents, he controlled the press and controlled the radio, and in general assumed police power over the state. But Hitler still managed to earn the support of the majority of Germans because his economic policies were able to pull Germany out of the Great Depression. In the 1930s, Hitler invested a huge amount of money in public works projects. So it was building these superhighways, bridges, canals, public buildings, and after 1935 started rearming the military forces. So Hitler put people back to work, and for a lot of Germans this was much better than what they had before. They had food, there was order and discipline, everyone was working hard, and things were seemingly looking up. Other countries still suffering through the Great Depression held up Germany as a model for economic recovery. But it was more than this that made Hitler popular. Hitler played upon traditional rural values of German life, and far more than in Italy, he used the Jews as a symbol for everything that was wrong in German society. Hitler spread this image of the Jew as being foreign capitalists who were corrupting German culture. Anti-Semitism, or discrimination towards Jews, didn't start with Hitler in Germany. Europe in general, and Germany in particular, had a long history of racism towards Jews. But Hitler really took racism towards Jews, or anti-Semitism, to another level. In his book Mein Kampf, Hitler argued his case against Jews and called for the racial purification of Germany. And this is what really sets Hitler apart from Mussolini. In Italy, Jews were a smaller minority, and they were part of Italian culture. And at first, Mussolini thought Hitler was being ridiculous. He agreed on almost everything with Hitler, except he didn't understand the hatred towards Jews. As the two became closer, and Germany and Italy became closer allies, Italy started its own program of anti-Semitism as well. Never anything on the scale of Germany. And in Germany, Hitler's anti-Semitism led to the establishment of the Nuremberg Laws, which were a series of laws that placed legal restrictions on Jews in Germany. So some of these restrictions were that Jews were not allowed to go to university, Jews were not allowed to be employed by the government, Jews were not allowed to marry Germans, and Jews had to identify themselves in public by wearing the Star of David.